So welcome to Herbs for Health Week 2 at the Concrete Gardens. This week we're going to start off with an infusion, a hot water infusion of a really common kind of forageable plant that you can find actually for quite a lot of the year. It's quite small in early spring, but you will see it in the Concrete Gardens and around the place right the way through into the autumn, so it's a nice one to make a hot infusion with, or what you might think of as a tea. So the plant that we're looking at, and I'm just going to put some bits over here out of the wind. So the plant that we're looking at is called Plantain. Unfortunately, nothing to do with bananas. That's often where people's brains goes. Don't know which was named after which, but they're different things. So this is Plantago lanceolata, and there's another one called Plantago major. And they are quite scrabbly looking plants. So this one is called lanceolata because it's got long lance-shaped leaves, and these are going to kind of get longer and thinner. And then Plantago major has little circular leaves which can get as big as dinner plates. We tend to use Plantago lanceolata whenever we're foraging because it tends to grow in cleaner places, really. Actually, that's very, very basically. So Plantago major tends to grow, and the phrase is used that it likes to be walked on. And I think in the past it was called white man's footprints because I think the European settlers brought it into North America and kind of spread it around quite a lot because it's not indigenous to there. But it also, funnily enough, can be used in a footprint kind of way. I think that might have had something to do with one of the uses. You can use it for blisters, so it's a real wound healer. And what people do sometimes is wrap their feet in plantain, either to prevent blisters or to treat blisters. And I know folk who've done that, and that apparently it's been quite effective. So, and that it kind of leads into some of the other uses for plantain. So plantain is used for a lot for respiratory and urinary tract problems, and it's effectively wound healing there as well. So it's got two slightly contradictory sounding characteristics. It both dries and it moistens. So what it does, if you can imagine, if you have like a really kind of gunky kind of sinusy thing going on where you've got lots of mucus but also lots of irritation. So if you were just to dry that mucus up, it would irritate the mucous membrane, so it would irritate all of the kind of sore skin. But if you were to just moisten it, you kind of overdo, it's already quite moist, there's a lot of mucus. So what the plantain does is it tightens those mucous membranes while soothing over the top with quite high mucilage content. So you would use that in respiratory conditions, and you also use that in urinary tract conditions. And as a tea, which we're going to make I'm going to do that now because my cup is determined to fly away. So I'm going to just take 3 nice fresh leaves. I'm going to chop them up a bit with scissors because that's what I find easiest to use. What that does is increases the surface area and means that you're getting more of those medicinal properties coming out into the tea. And then I'm just gonna, it was open I think, add some boiling water. And then I'm just gonna cover that with this little lid that I've got here. So just gonna cover that, and what that does is, doesn't quite cover it. Let's see, I'll just cover it with this. So what that does is it keeps all of the medicinal properties inside there, and it also keeps your tea nice and warm. And I'm going to leave that to sit for 10-15 minutes, and then if you want you can strain it out. I don't mind cutting random bits of leaf, drinking random bits of leaf, but if you don't like that, then just strain it out, or you could make it in a teapot beforehand and use a little strainer. And that's a really nice one at this time of year for kind of allergies, that end of things. So any kind of like obviously pollen tends to be the issue, so if you're set off by kind of pollen allergies, plantain tea is really good for that, and it's really nice mixed with something like later on in the year with elderflower, which also has some kind of, and also with nettle, which has antihistamine properties. So we kind of nettle, elderflower and plantain tea, either fresh or dried, is a really nice mix for anyone, especially with kind of really sneezy allergies that just get into their sinuses. And it's also a really good first aid plant. So I actually have a little cut on my knuckle, which is a yoga related injury because I can't balance, and I fell over and cracked my knuckle on the hearth beside where I was doing yoga. So what I could do for that is get a bit of plantain, chew it up, pop it on the cut, and then use another leaf of plantain just to kind of hold that in place. And then you've got a little plantain poultice with a kind of plaster ready made, and what that does is it does the same thing that it's doing in the respiratory system. It tightens the membranes there to sort of stop the bleeding, but it also has that soothing mucilage, so it soothes on top of it as well. So it's a nice little trick to have, and it's a good one if you're out on a walk with someone else. Obviously get them to chew their own bit of plantain. You don't want to be putting other people's saliva into your cuts, but it's also good for bites, for stings, almost anything. Well, any kind of injury to your skin, you can definitely use your kind of plantain for. So that's Plantago species, so Plantago lanceolata, and making a lovely hot tea infusion. Hi, so this is our stage 1 of our recipe for fermenting spring greens. It's a relatively simple recipe, but you need to do it over a course of time. So you can do this with any wild greens. It's quite a nice thing to do with wild greens that you're often trying to get rid of, things that can be seen of as weeds. So one of the things I'm going to put in is this ground elder that grows quite abundantly and a lot of gardeners aren't that keen on. So the basics with this are we're going to chop up some greens, we're going to pop some salt on them, and we'll be weighing that and working out exactly how much salt we need, leaving them to sit for a little while, then coming back to them and processing them, and then leaving them for kind of 4 to 7 days to ferment and to turn into your fermented wild greens. And you can then dry them if you want to, but I quite like to have them fresh. So the quickest and easiest way to do this is to chop them with a pair of scissors. So I've got my wild garlic here, so I'm just going to chop that into my bowl. Oh, and actually, first things first, I'm just going to weigh the bowl. I'll chop them in with it on the scales. So, like a lot of wild ferments, you want to have 1 to 3% salt. So the weight of your greens and then the weight of the salt are that kind of proportion to each other. So we're just gonna pop these in. So you need a relatively high volume of these to get very much weight at all. So you want to have at least 100 grams, because that'll be 1 to 3 grams of salt. It's quite difficult to measure anything less than that. So because these are quite light, we're going to put in quite a few. So there we go. So that's the wild garlic. And then ground elder. And you could add in other things, so things which have relatively what I would call kind of like juicy leaves, because you want them to get quite a lot of water out of the plant. So one that I would maybe use is plantain leaves. Those are quite good. And they're kind of become a little bit bigger and a bit more abundant later in the spring. So we've had quite a late spring in Glasgow this year, so a lot of things aren't coming out yet. You could also do it with bought greens, but the difficulty with those is sometimes the fermentation might be a little bit more tricky, because they don't have they've been treated or they've been washed and things like that. So I'm going to try this so we've got nearly 100 grams there. Let's go a wee bit more. Just put some of these in as well, actually. So this is my few flowered leek, and you can put flowers and things in as well. You want to have lots of stem and leaf is really good, because that's where a lot of the moisture is, as you can possibly even hear with me cutting this. Okay, so that's just getting to 100. Oh, last few cuts. I'm making these as small as possible to help with manipulating them in and out of jars and things like that. So I'm going to zero that. And I'm going to add, so it's 1 to 3 grams of salt. So I'm going to aim for kind of one and a bit, or kind of just under 2. I'm getting there. It's 1. Nearly. And that's us, that's 2 grams. Okay, so what we're going to do with this is I'm just going to give it a bit of a shake so that the salt goes around and in there a little bit. And then I'm just going to cover this with a piece of cloth and let it sit for, maybe an hour or so. And we'll come back to stage 2 for that. So this is the second stage of the foraged wild greens being fermented. So we left our greens sitting with the correct amount of salt to kind of make 1 to 3% salt to wild greens. And then what we're going to do is we left them sit just for an hour or so covered so that the salt could start to work. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer these to a slightly larger bowl. And already, yeah, you can feel the moisture there. I'm just getting some of that salt out. Okay. And so, there's a bit. So I'm just going to give these a bit of a batter with my hands, just to kind of get some more of that out. And now these might actually be wet enough to do this already. We've got two options here. Basically what you can do is those are quite moist. You can get more liquid out of it by setting this aside overnight. So what you would do is take a smaller bowl, place it on top, weight it down with a jar with water in it, and then cover that. And if you want to, you could put some books on to weight it even further. And then just like I say, leave that at least for an hour or two, but maybe even overnight. But I think it's quite possible that we could actually jar up this one as it is, because there's a lot of moisture coming out of it already. So I'll just show you how I would do that. So we're going to try and kind of gamble with not doing the overnight pressing on this one, so because this looks really quite juicy. So we're going to get a little jar with something that you've got that can fit inside it. So just using a little amber glass bottle there, and picking off all of the greens there. So I'm just going to use my hands for this. Don't know if you can hear quite how wet that is. It's very soggy. There's quite a lot of moisture. If you imagine how crispy like a cabbage leaf is compared to this, these wild greens are really make a lot of moisture out of them. So possibly even some at the bottom here. So because this is just a little amount, I'm going to actually use this bottle to do the pressing. Let's see this. Yeah, this is just coming right out. Yeah, so that liquid's coming out really nicely there. So just pressing really hard. This is how you get your fermenting workout. And then just making sure I've got a couple of little bits sticking up. Just want to make sure they're pressed down really nicely. A little bit of my finger. So what should happen is the bottle almost holds itself in place eventually. So it just sort of gets sucked in. So yeah, that's our liquid right up there. And this will start forming more liquid as you go along as well. If you're a bit nervous about the amount of liquid, you can just add a little bit of purified water. And then what we're going to do is just borrow this to show you. So you just put, possibly a smaller bit of muslin would be big enough. Right, put the big bit on. So put on a piece of muslin, so move that out the way. And then attach with this elastic band. And then what you want to do is just every day have a little check that the water level is still above the level of the plant material, and then leave this for 4 to 7 days. Start tasting it after day 4, and when it's got that kind of fermented fizz to it and it's a taste that you like, take all this contraption off, and then you might want to redo this and put the greens into a smaller jar just so you're taking up less room in your fridge, and then put the greens in a little jar in the fridge, and you can eat that as a side. Because it's got lots of kind of garlics and alliums in it, it's got loads of really good anti-infective stuff, and it's also really good for your gut. So that's our forage fermented wild greens, and remember you can do that for all kinds of different greens. So whatever you've got that's got lots of juiciness to it, you can make it with this. So what we're going to make for this video is what's often referred to as bitters. So that can be a word that people aren't too keen on because people often don't like bitter tastes, but actually bitter taste is really good for your digestion. It's really good to get get your saliva going, get your body ready to process food. So it's quite common that bitter things will be taken at the start of a meal just to get things stimulated, especially if you've had kind of sluggish stomach, if you've been having difficulties digesting things. It's good to give yourself a little kind of bitters kick. Now one way of doing that is a plant that we all know really well, which is dandelion, is to just chew on a little bit of dandelion leaf, which is great and which is something that you can absolutely do. But another thing to do is to make your own bitters. So we do that using either cider vinegar or vodka, and we use the root and the leaf of the dandelion. We probably don't use the flower because that's quite sweet, so we want to stick with the bitter taste. We're also going to put in a little bit of dried chamomile, and it does help with digestion. Obviously it's got digestive quality in itself, but it's also got a little bit of bitterness, but also a tiny bit of sweetness, so it does add a little bit of sweetness to it. And then other things that you can add are citrus peel. So if you have peel from unwaxed oranges or lemons, you can just kind of peel that, dry it slightly, and then use that in your vinegar. So really simply what we're going to do is I'm going to remove the dandelion flower. Now dandelion leaf is diuretic and dandelion root is laxative, so it helps basically with the bitters just to get your system moving, but also just to kind of get things eliminated as well. So I've picked these dandelions, and you can either leave them to dry for a few days and then brush the mud off them, or you can wash them and then just let them dry. So I'm getting plenty of root here. So, and the root can also be made into sort of like a coffee substitute, so it definitely has a good bit of bitterness in it. We expect the root in the spring to be the most bitter, and I'm just going to take these wee ends off, because basically what the plant does is it stores sugars in the root for the winter, and then in the spring those sugars have pretty much run out, so we're just got all the bitter principles left behind. So I'm going to pop these into the jar. So you generally don't want to overfill your jar, because there's a small possibility that the liquid in the plant material will make your vinegar too diluted, although with vinegar that's a lower risk than with other things. And then just going to pop some of these chamomile flowers in, so just a little sprinkle of them. These will kind of add a different type of bitter principle, but also help with the digestion just in general. And then we carefully pour over our apple cider vinegar. So just do that gently, allowing the vinegar to soak into the plant material. And then I'm going to shake this at the end just to make sure everything's well soaked into the vinegar, because at the moment as it's sitting, some of the chamomile's kind of sitting up out of the vinegar, and what can happen there is you can get kind of a wee bit of mouldiness or things rotting, which you obviously don't want. So my first thing is just check that I've got that on right, yep. So just give that a little bit of a shake, a little bit of an invert up and down. And that makes me see, there's still a little bit more space in that, so I can top that up with a little bit more vinegar. And this will have a better taste to it within a week to 10 days. To get the maximum, I would leave it for 2, 3, 4 weeks if you can. And then just take a small amount of it in water before meals, especially if you're going to have like a big, rich, kind of hearty, fatty meal. Bitters are a really good way to go. So dandelion root, dandelion leaf, your chamomile, and if you want you can add in some citrus peel as well, or if you have any other bitter things that you can think of, always good to have an experiment with them. And so that's your dandelion leaf and root bitters.